Step into the shadows of New Orleans, 1855, a city breathing with secrets, cruelty, and whispered fear. Tonight's story is not about a master, but about a slave girl whose presence shattered 8 different mistresses, one by one, leaving behind ruined households and unanswered questions. This is a tale stitched together from court records, plantation letters, and forgotten accounts, hours of digging to separate myth from disturbing truth. Before we descend deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on real historical traces, subscribe, because uncovering the truth buried in history takes serious work, and this journey is only beginning. New Orleans in 1855 was a city that lived 2 lives at once. By daylight, it glittered with commerce, cotton shipments crowding the docks, riverboats groaning along the Mississippi, and elegant carriages rolling past wrought iron balconies. But beneath that polished surface pulsed something darker. Wealth was built on human bondage, and every grand home carried unseen suffering within its walls. The city prospered loudly, yet its foundations were laid in silence, fear, and control. The streets themselves felt alive, heavy with heat and humidity, where the air clung to skin and breath came slow. Narrow alleys twisted between old French buildings, and gas lamps flickered at night, casting long, distorted shadows. Sounds traveled far in this city, footsteps, whispers, suddens quickly swallowed by distance. It was easy for terrible things to happen and vanish without witnesses, especially after sunset. Slavery in New Orleans was not hidden on distant plantations alone. It was woven directly into city life. Enslaved people cooked meals, cleaned houses, carried children, and slept just beyond the walls of their owners. Markets openly sold human beings, their ages, strengths, and temperaments debated like livestock. Families were separated casually, and resistance, no matter how small, was answered with cruelty disguised as discipline. Among white households, especially those run by elite women, fear was a constant undercurrent. Mistresses were expected to maintain order, obedience, and reputation. Any disruption inside the home, illness, emotional collapse, strange behavior, was seen as weakness. In a society obsessed with control, losing command of one's household was almost worse than losing wealth. Religion and superstition thrived in this tension. Catholic rituals mixed with African spiritual beliefs, whispered warnings, and folk remedies passed quietly between enslaved people. Many mistresses believed unseen forces lurked everywhere, curses, omens, divine punishment. When unexplained events occurred, reason often gave way to dread. Fear filled the gaps where understanding failed. Records from the era are fragmented, selective, and biased. Official documents recorded property, not pain. Letters spoke carefully, hiding shame behind polite language. What truly happened inside homes was rarely written plainly, leaving historians to piece together truths from absences, rumors, and sudden changes in ownership. Silence itself became evidence. It was within this oppressive, watchful, and deeply fearful city that the story of the slave girl began. New Orleans in 1855 was the perfect place for a nightmare to grow quietly, protected by wealth, tradition, and denial, until its consequences could no longer be ignored. She had no name preserved in the records, and that absence alone speaks volumes. Like countless others, her identity was stripped away the moment she was reduced to property. Bills of sale described her only in fragments: age, physical condition, temperament. Cold details meant to determine value, not humanity. Whatever name she was born with vanished, replaced by labels that shifted with each new household she entered. From surviving descriptions, she was young, likely in her late teens when first brought into one of the city's wealthier homes. She was noted as quiet, observant, and physically unremarkable, traits often prized by mistresses who wanted obedience without attention. Yet there were hints, buried between lines, that she unsettled people. Words like watchful, unnerving, or difficult to read appeared in correspondence, subtle warnings masked as casual remarks. Unlike enslaved workers sent to fields or docks, she lived almost entirely indoors. She moved through bedrooms, kitchens, and hallways, intimate spaces where emotions frayed and secrets lingered. She saw mistresses without their guests, without makeup, without authority. In those private hours, power dynamics blurred. The enslaved girl heard arguments, confessions, and fears never meant for anyone else. Those who later wrote about her mentioned her silence more than her actions. She spoke little, followed instructions precisely, and never openly resisted. In a brutal system that expected rebellion to be loud and punishable, her restraint was unsettling. Some mistresses complained that they never knew what she was thinking, that her gaze lingered too long, that her presence felt heavy, even when she stood still. Rumors began to attach themselves to her as she moved between homes. Enslaved people whispered that she carried sorrow like a shadow. White women whispered something darker, that she brought misfortune. None could point to a single act, a single crime. What frightened them was accumulation, moods shifting, sleep disturbed, tempers unraveling after she arrived. It is important to understand that these fears were shaped by the cruelty of the system itself. Any enslaved person who did not behave as expected became a mirror for a mistress's own anxieties. Guilt, repression, and powerlessness found an outlet in superstition. The girl became a vessel for everything the household could not explain or control. By the time her name disappeared completely from the records, replaced only by repeated transfers of ownership, one thing was clear: wherever she went, stability followed briefly, then collapsed. Whether she caused that collapse or merely revealed what was already broken remains the haunting question at the heart of her story. She was not kept long in any one household. Records show a pattern that stood out even among the brutal normalcy of slavery in New Orleans. She was purchased, transferred, and resold with unusual frequency. In a system designed to squeeze every ounce of labor from a human life, constant resale suggested trouble. Owners did not lightly give up an enslaved person they had paid for unless something felt deeply wrong. The first transfer was explained away as inconvenience. A mistress claimed she was unsuitable for domestic harmony, a vague phrase often used when something felt off but could not be named. There were no accusations of theft, no reports of open defiance. On paper, she had done nothing wrong. Yet within months, sometimes weeks, she was moved on, quietly passed to another household. Each sale followed a similar pattern. She would arrive described as healthy and capable, often at a reasonable price. Soon after, letters hinted at disturbances, sleepless nights, constant tension, sudden illnesses among the women of the house. Not the men. not the children, always the mistress. These complaints never named her directly as the cause, but her departure always followed shortly after. What made her situation even more unsettling was that the resales often happened privately. Instead of public auctions, which could draw attention and questions, owners preferred discreet arrangements. This secrecy suggests embarrassment or fear, emotions powerful enough to override financial loss. Some mistresses were willing to accept less money than they paid just to have her gone. With each new home, the rumors traveled ahead of her. Enslaved people recognized the signs, quickly whispered warnings, extra prayers, uneasy glances. White mistresses, however, often believed they could manage what others could not. Pride pushed them to buy her, convinced that discipline, faith, or authority would succeed where others had failed. The speed of these resales increased over time. Early owners kept her for nearly a year. Later ones barely lasted months. Something seemed to accelerate, fear compounding, patience eroding faster with each transfer. The pattern itself became the warning, though no one spoke it aloud. By the time she had passed through multiple households, she was no longer seen as merely an enslaved girl. She became a problem to be solved, a burden to be passed along. Her repeated resale did not erase the unease she left behind. Instead, it spread across the city, planting the same quiet dread in house after house. The first mistress to own her believed the rumors were exaggerated. She was a respected woman, newly married, confident in her authority and eager to prove she could manage a household flawlessly. At first, everything appeared normal. The enslaved girl worked quietly, followed instructions, and drew little attention. Guests complimented the order of the home, and the mistress took pride in believing she had succeeded where others might have failed. Within weeks, subtle changes began. The mistress complained of restless sleep, waking in the early hours drenched in sweat, convinced someone had been watching her. She began snapping at servants over small mistakes and grew increasingly withdrawn from social visits. Letters to friends hinted at exhaustion and a sense of unease she could not explain, though she never named its source. Her health soon followed her mood. Sudden headaches, trembling hands, and fainting spells became common. Doctors were called, diagnoses offered: female weakness, nervous disorder, excessive strain. But treatments brought no relief. Strangely, these episodes worsened on days when the enslaved girl was assigned to work closest to her, attending bedrooms and personal spaces. The household atmosphere thickened with tension. Other servants whispered that the mistress avoided being alone, insisting lamps remain lit even during daylight. She accused people of moving objects, rearranging rooms, or conspiring against her. No evidence supported these fears, yet her certainty only grew stronger. Control, once her greatest strength, slipped from her grasp. Her husband, concerned for reputation as much as health, began spending more time away. Society was unforgiving toward women who appeared unstable, and gossip spread quickly. Invitations slowed, then stopped. The once proud mistress became isolated within her own home, clinging to routine while quietly unraveling. Eventually, the decision was made without explanation. The enslaved girl was sold privately, removed almost overnight. Officially, the sale was due to household difficulties. Unofficially, those close to the family knew the truth. The mistress believed her peace could only return once the girl was gone. But the damage was already done. Though the girl left, the mistress never fully recovered. Her breakdown marked the beginning of a pattern. No one yet recognized the first household shattered, not by rebellion or violence, but by an invisible erosion of sanity that followed the girl wherever she went. After the first household collapsed, a pattern began to emerge, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Each new mistress entered ownership with confidence, certain that discipline, routine, or faith would prevent any trouble. And each time, for a brief period, it seemed they were right. The home would run smoothly, visitors would see nothing amiss, and the enslaved girl would remain silent and obedient, almost invisible. Then the atmosphere would shift. It always began with unease rather than events. Mistresses described feeling unsettled for no clear reason, as if the house itself had changed. Ordinary sounds, footsteps in corridors, doors creaking, distant voices, started to feel threatening. Nights grew longer, sleep became fractured, and mornings arrived heavy with dread instead of rest. This fear never spread evenly through the household. The men noticed little. Children continued their routines. Other enslaved people felt tension, but learned to stay quiet. The instability centered almost entirely on the mistress, isolating her emotionally. She became the sole bearer of the anxiety, trapped between public composure and private terror. As fear took root, behavior followed. Mistresses grew controlling, then erratic. Rules changed daily. Punishments were issued, then regretted. Trust eroded between household members, and accusations became common. Objects were blamed. Servants suspected, faith questioned. The girl remained constant, silent, observant, untouched by the chaos around her. Doctors, priests, and relatives were consulted, yet none could identify a cause. Nervous disorders were diagnosed, prayers were offered, tonics prescribed. Nothing worked. The more the mistress searched for an explanation, the more unstable she appeared, feeding the very rumors she feared. Society's judgment closed in fast. What made the pattern unmistakable was repetition. Different women, different homes, different circumstances, yet the same emotional collapse followed. Fear arrived without warning, intensified without cause, and lingered even after the girl was removed. The instability seemed less like coincidence and more like contagion. By the fifth or sixth household, whispers began circulating quietly among elite women. Some refused to purchase her outright. Others did so in secret, convinced they could withstand what others could not. But the pattern held firm. Fear, once introduced, grew roots deep enough to crack even the most carefully controlled lives. The terror that spread through these homes was rarely loud or dramatic. It did not arrive as screams, violence, or open rebellion. Instead, it worked quietly through the mind. Mistresses described a constant sense of being watched, even when alone. Rooms that once felt familiar began to feel hostile, as though the walls themselves held memory and judgment. This psychological strain thrived in isolation. A mistress could not openly admit fear of someone she legally owned. Doing so would expose weakness and invite ridicule. So the fear stayed trapped inside her thoughts, growing stronger without challenge. Each doubt fed the next, until reality and imagination blurred beyond separation. The enslaved girl's silence intensified this effect. She did not argue, threaten, or explain herself. Her calm presence offered nothing to confront, nothing to punish. When fear has no visible enemy, it turns inward. Mistresses began interpreting neutral expressions as defiance, stillness as intention, obedience as deception. Daily routines became rituals of anxiety. Every interaction was analyzed afterward, her tone, her posture, her timing. A delayed response or an unreadable glance could unravel an entire day's composure. Over time, the mistress no longer reacted to events themselves, but to what she believed they meant. Sleep deprivation worsened everything. Repeated nights of poor rest left these women mentally exposed. Dreams bled into waking thoughts. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Minor stresses became unbearable, and emotional control slipped in ways that felt sudden but had been building for weeks. The terror also reshaped authority. Instead of commanding respect, mistresses began pleading with order, rearranging staff, changing schedules, clinging to superstition. Some avoided rooms entirely. Others insisted on constant company. Authority, once absolute, fractured under the weight of unspoken fear. What made this psychological collapse so devastating was its invisibility. There were no bruises to explain it, no crimes to record. From the outside, these women appeared fragile or unstable. Inside the household, however, the terror felt real, consuming, and inescapable, an unseen force tightening its grip until the household itself began to break. As the incidents multiplied, whispers began moving faster than records ever could. Among enslaved people, the girl's name, whatever it had once been, was replaced by cautious glances and lowered voices. Stories traveled through kitchens, courtyards, and shared sleeping quarters, carried carefully so they would not reach the wrong ears. She was spoken of as someone marked by sorrow, someone followed by misfortune, rather than causing it outright. Among elite white women, the rumors took a different shape. They were shared over tea tables and behind fans, framed as concern rather than fear. Mistresses spoke of other households where a woman had lost her nerves or fallen into strange humors. Shortly after acquiring a certain girl, names were rarely said aloud, but everyone knew who was being discussed. These rumors were sharpened by competition and pride. Some women dismissed the stories as excuses for weakness, convinced that proper discipline and strong faith would protect them. Others listened closely, weighing each detail, measuring their own resilience against the warnings. In a society where reputation meant survival, believing the rumors felt dangerous, but ignoring them felt worse. What gave the whispers power was their consistency. Different tellers, different households, yet the same outcome. A calm beginning, an unexplained shift, emotional collapse, quiet removal. The repetition turned gossip into something closer to collective memory. Even those who claimed not to believe still hesitated before making a purchase. The girl herself became a symbol rather than a person. She represented everything that frightened mistresses, but could not be openly acknowledged: loss of control, moral guilt, and the fragile nature of authority. Blaming her was easier than confronting the cruelty and tension that defined their own lives. Ironically, the rumors also increased her value in certain circles. A few buyers saw danger as proof of strength, believing that fear could be beaten through dominance. They sought her out deliberately, convinced that mastering what others feared would elevate their status. Pride blinded them to the pattern, repeating beneath their confidence. By the time the rumors reached their peak, the damage was already widespread. Whether believed or dismissed, they followed her into every new home, shaping expectations before she ever crossed the threshold. In a city fueled by whispers, fear no longer needed proof. It only needed repetition to become real. Religion and superstition intertwined tightly with the daily life of New Orleans in 1855, creating a fertile ground for fear to take root. Many households were devoutly Catholic, observing rituals and prayers with precision, but popular belief blended seamlessly with African and Creole spiritual practices brought by enslaved people. Holy water charms and whispered incantations existed alongside official mass, creating an atmosphere in which the unseen could easily be blamed for misfortune. Mistresses were especially susceptible to these beliefs. Their lives were built on appearances and social order, and any disruption threatened not only their households, but also their reputations. When strange occurrences, illnesses, sleepless nights, sudden emotional breakdowns appeared, women often looked for spiritual explanations. A silent, watchful slave girl became an easy vessel for imagined curses or divine punishment. Superstition was reinforced by the enslaved community. Secretly, they might pray for protection or place discreet charms to ward off ill fortune. These acts, meant for safety, often added to the aura surrounding her. When misfortune struck, observers assumed supernatural influence, deepening the fear. The girl's calm and quiet nature seemed to confirm their worst suspicions that she possessed some hidden power beyond human understanding. Even ordinary events were given dark meaning. A missed step on the staircase, a shadow cast oddly by candlelight, or a sudden gust of wind could be interpreted as a sign that some unseen force was at work. The more mistresses believed in these omens, the more their fear compounded, creating a feedback loop that intensified stress and illness. Priests and spiritual advisors were sometimes called in to intervene. Exorcisms, blessings, or strict confessions were administered, often with limited effect. While intended to restore calm, these rituals reinforced the idea that some malignant presence had taken root. By seeking spiritual solutions, the mistresses inadvertently legitimized the girl's growing reputation as a harbinger of misfortune. The line between psychological strain and perceived supernatural influence blurred. No one could pinpoint a tangible cause for the disturbances, so it became easier to attribute events to curses or divine retribution. The girl's silence, obedience, and inscrutable expression only heightened the sense of mystery, as if her very presence carried an unseen weight that defied logic. By entwining religion and superstition with fear, the households became self-reinforcing theaters of terror. Every glance, every misstep, every unexplained event fed the narrative that the girl was more than human, an almost mythic figure whose presence threatened the fragile order of New Orleans' elite homes. In this city of rituals and shadows, the unseen became as powerful as the visible, and the girl's legend only grew stronger. Sudden illnesses and breakdowns began to define the household she entered, leaving a trail of confusion and alarm. Mistresses, previously considered strong and composed, found themselves incapacitated by mysterious fevers, fainting spells, and debilitating headaches. Physicians were summoned, but no clear diagnosis ever emerged. Treatments were applied, tonics, leeches, rest. But nothing offered lasting relief, as if the very air of the home had turned against them. The pattern of these ailments was striking. They rarely affected children or male members of the household. Instead, they seemed to target the mistress alone. Sometimes the illnesses arrived immediately after the girl entered the home. Other times, they appeared weeks later, slowly eroding physical health and mental resilience. Each new case reinforced the perception that something extraordinary or cursed was at play. Emotional breakdowns followed physical distress. Mistresses became withdrawn, tearful or irrational, snapping at servants or imagining conspiracies where none existed. Small mishaps were magnified into crises. Meals burned, laundry spoiled, and the household's rhythm fractured. Outsiders could not always see the cause, only the effect. Once orderly homes descending into chaos. The fear of contagion grew alongside the illnesses. Some mistresses warned neighbors privately, suggesting that the girl brought misfortune wherever she went. Others denied the whispers but still acted with extreme caution, keeping lights on at night, avoiding solitude, and altering daily routines. The link between the girl and these incidents became an unspoken truth, cemented by repeated occurrences. Servants and family members noticed the breakdowns and responded cautiously. Enslaved workers might pray quietly for protection, rearrange tasks to avoid confrontation, or even attempt subtle interventions. Male family members, often detached from domestic duties, failed to notice the escalation until it was nearly too late. This isolation intensified the mistress's suffering, as support dwindled precisely when it was most needed. Despite repeated episodes, the girl herself remained unaffected. She carried out her duties calmly, never showing signs of illness or agitation. Her composure stood in stark contrast to the turmoil around her, heightening the sense that her presence alone was linked to the mistress's decline. The contrast created an almost supernatural aura, suggesting that she wielded influence without effort or awareness. Over time, these repeated breakdowns became part of her legend. Households began to anticipate them, yet no one could prevent them. Physical illness, emotional collapse, and pervasive dread combined to make her a figure of fear and mystery. By the time she left each home, the damage was done, leaving behind stories that would circulate quietly, growing darker with each retelling. What made her story even more perplexing was the lack of intervention from the masters themselves. Despite repeated signs of distress among their wives, the men often appeared indifferent or powerless to act. Some dismissed the complaints as typical female nervousness or hysteria, a socially accepted explanation for behavior they could neither understand nor control. Others were more pragmatic, focused on maintaining appearances and preserving wealth, choosing to quietly transfer the girl rather than confront the underlying disturbances. Masters relied heavily on societal norms that prioritized household reputation above personal well-being. Admitting that a slave girl could unsettle a mistress, or that fear and breakdowns were real, was socially dangerous. Men risked ridicule or scandal if they appeared unable to maintain authority. In this rigid hierarchy, practical solutions often meant avoiding the problem rather than addressing it, perpetuating the cycle of fear. Attempts at discipline rarely succeeded. The girl's calm demeanor and quiet obedience frustrated those who expected resistance to be visible and punishable. Physical threats, verbal reprimands, and harsh labor assignments had little effect. She seemed untouched by traditional methods of control, leaving masters and overseers to conclude, often in hushed tones, that something inexplicable was at work. Even when masters did act, their actions were inconsistent. Some sold her quickly, hoping to remove the source of tension. Others attempted stricter supervision, placing her under closer watch, only to see the same patterns of distress continue. The repetition of failure reinforced the growing reputation that she carried with her from house to house, making it almost impossible for a new mistress to approach the situation with confidence. Servants, both enslaved and free, noticed the unusual dynamics. Whispers circulated about the girl's presence and the master's passive complicity, feeding the narrative that her influence was somehow beyond ordinary human comprehension. Yet challenging the master's authority was not an option, leaving everyone, mistress and servant alike, trapped in the escalating tension. In some cases, masters attempted medical or religious remedies, hoping to restore the mistress's composure and the household's stability. Doctors' tonics, spiritual interventions, or blessings sometimes offered temporary relief, but never solved the underlying problem. Each failure deepened the fear, leaving the mistress isolated and the master perplexed. Ultimately, the lack of decisive action allowed the legend to grow. With no one able, or willing, to control the situation, the girl's presence became synonymous with instability. Masters' inaction, whether due to ignorance, pride, or societal pressure, ensured that the cycle continued, spreading fear and reinforcing the mysterious, almost supernatural reputation she carried throughout New Orleans. By the time she disappeared from the records, the girl's trail had already left a lasting impression across multiple households. Her sudden removals or sales were rarely explained beyond vague statements about household difficulties or unsuitability, leaving no clear account of her fate. Historians later piecing together her story encounter frustrating gaps: letters cease, bills of sale stop, and mentions vanish as if she had simply been erased from existence. Her disappearance fueled speculation. Some believed she had been sold far away, beyond the city and even the state, perhaps ending up on a plantation where her presence would no longer disrupt lives. Others whispered that she had died young, though no death records confirm this. The uncertainty surrounding her fate only heightened the mystique that had followed her throughout New Orleans. In elite circles, the absence of closure created fertile ground for rumor. Women who had experienced her presence shared stories in hushed tones, warning others while preserving their own reputations. Over time, these anecdotes became legend, with each retelling adding embellishment, a whisper of curses, a hint of revenge, or a suggestion of supernatural powers. The girl became more than a person; she became a symbol of fear, loss of control, and the fragility of authority. The impact of her removal was felt long after she was gone. Households that had once been orderly found lingering anxiety in the air, a residue of the psychological havoc she had wrought. Mistresses continued to monitor new servants closely, haunted by memories of the inexplicable breakdowns. Even without her presence, the shadow she left influenced behavior and decision-making for years. Enslaved people remembered her differently. Among them, she was not merely a source of fear, but a figure of quiet endurance. She had survived the harshest scrutiny without visible complaint, moving through dangerous households with caution and awareness. Stories of her resilience circulated quietly, shaping community memory and serving as a subtle reminder of the power of observation, patience, and presence. The disappearance also illustrates the limitations of historical records. Enslaved individuals were rarely named, their lives recorded only in transactional or incidental notes. When they vanished from the ledger, it was as if they never existed. Her story, reconstructed from fragments and rumors, highlights the challenge of separating fact from legend in a society determined to ignore or erase the humanity of the oppressed. Ultimately, the mystery of her fate cemented her place in New Orleans lore. Whether sold, relocated, or lost to history, she became a haunting presence in the collective imagination of those who had lived through her visits. Her disappearance did not end her story, it transformed it, ensuring that the terror, fascination, and unanswered questions surrounding her would endure far beyond her physical life. The legend of the slave girl endured long after she vanished from records, because the stories she left behind refused to fade. Each household she entered carried echoes of her presence, fear, disorder, and whispered warnings, so that even those who never met her felt the weight of her reputation. Her influence had become larger than life, entwined with the fears and superstitions of an entire city. Those who had experienced her directly often recounted the events with a mixture of awe and terror. Mistresses described sleepless nights, sudden illnesses, and the inexplicable breakdowns that seemed to follow her. Even in retelling, they struggled to articulate what had happened, reinforcing the sense that her effect was beyond ordinary understanding. The silence of the girl herself added to the myth. She had never defended, explained, or justified her presence, leaving only the chaos she seemed to inspire. The story spread beyond individual households into the wider social memory of New Orleans. Elite women exchanged warnings privately, ensuring that her name, or the fear associated with it, remained known. Tales of her quiet observation, uncanny timing, and unshakable composure were told as cautionary accounts, emphasizing the dangers of underestimating a seemingly powerless enslaved girl. Over time, these stories became part of folklore, blending historical fact with speculation. Some claimed she possessed supernatural powers, others insisted she was merely extraordinarily perceptive, reading emotions and intentions with frightening accuracy. Whatever the truth, the repeated pattern of fear and breakdowns lent credibility to both interpretations, making her a figure whose legend transcended any single household. Her disappearance from records only magnified her mystique. Without a known fate, the girl became a symbol, a ghost-like presence whose influence could not be measured or contained. People projected onto her the anxieties and insecurities of the era, the fragility of authority, the consequences of oppression, and the vulnerability of those who believed themselves untouchable. The enslaved community preserved a different memory of her. She was seen as resilient and enduring, moving through dangerous spaces with a careful awareness that allowed her to survive. Stories celebrated her quiet strength, her patience, and her ability to navigate impossible circumstances, offering a counter-narrative to the fear that gripped the White households. Ultimately, the girl's legacy became a haunting reflection of New Orleans itself, a city of shadows, whispers, and hidden truths. Her story reminded all who heard it that terror could reside in silence, that power could exist where it was least expected, and that some figures, though erased from official history, leave a mark on memory so indelible it cannot be forgotten.